Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and the issues that Creative Assembly has going forward with regards to their DLC. Now pricing is going to play a big role in that, but I would say it's not necessarily the biggest issue that Creative Assembly has on hand. They did very well with the release of Decay, to be certain, with free reworks for the Dwarves, Empire, and Nurgle, 3 new campaigns, well, 4 new campaigns if you consider Epidemius, and they released a lot of content, and Decay has been very well received. Now, what Legend of Total War has said based on his sources in Creative Assembly, and I did ask him what CA was going to do going forward with the DLC, but what he knows, and he did mention it was subject to change, is that Creative Assembly first and foremost does need to decide whether or not Decay was profitable for them. Now, that may sound very shocking. I mean, we're looking at a DLC that has risen above even Forge of the Castors, which was fairly well received by the community. I've done polls on my channel, which indicate that a vast majority of people that did buy, do play Warhammer 3 did buy the DLC. The question, of course, with those kind of polls, how many people did Decay bring back? I mean, the Empire and Dwarves are two of the most popular races in the setting, so with the DLC that did a really good job for those, I imagine that quite a few people did come back, and plenty of those probably did buy the DLC. But you gotta understand, there's a lot of people pissed off and have turned away from Warhammer 3, and just one good DLC does not fix that. It is a good step in the right direction, but it's worth pointing out that compared to some of the last DLCs we got for Warhammer 2, the actual success that Forge of the Castors and Decay achieved is not necessarily greater than that. It is on par. For instance, the total number of concurrent players was higher with things like Silence and the Fury, or with Warden and the Punch, so kind of worth pointing that out. Or Twisted and Twilight. So those DLCs sold more copies, they had more concurrent players. Based on estimates that I've seen online, it does seem like Forge of Castors sold like 75 to 200,000 copies, and that is likely the number they're going to get with Decay. Is that profitable for Creative Assembly? Well, it's hard to say really, because we don't know what the price was, what the budget has. But what we do know are the following things. We do know that Creative Assembly has like 20 people working on DLC, or that was before the complete and utter debacle of Hyenas, Pharaoh, and Shadows of Change, so they might have increased that. But with 20 people working for like half a year, because that's probably the time it took to make it, with the DLC team, they probably would have needed like $1.5 million, dependent on salaries, of course, and other costs like voice acting and all that. So let's say anywhere between $1 million to $2 million, $1.5 million. Now you might say, oh, okay, so if Decay sold 100,000 copies, they obviously would have made that, $2.5 million. But it's not that simple, because Steam does take 30% of that. They take their cut. And it wasn't sold for $25 initially, it was sold for $24 or so. It depends on regional pricing and all that, but let's say 24 would be reasonable, even a bit lower than that. So that's the first thing you gotta take into consideration. Then you also have to consider the fact that Warhammer 3 is a licensed game, so they have to pay Games Workshop a percent of the revenue that they get. Now, how much they pay Games Workshop, it's hard to say. Like, some people have claimed that it's even as high as 40%, though I think like Creative Assembly and Sega get a better deal considering the success of their games. But still, even if it's something like 20%, again, you gotta understand that. So if they only sold 100,000 copies, I think that they're probably anywhere between having Decay slightly unprofitable for them and slightly profitable. That's probably where I would stand right now based on everything, all the data I personally have on that. Obviously, in the long term, it's going to be profitable, I no doubt about that, but it's certainly not the grand slam success that Creative Assembly may have expected. Now, one thing that is certainly off-putting to a good number of people is the price. Even people who did buy the DLC, quite a few people, like 30% of people that voted in my poll, close to 30%, did say that they considered the price too high. Now, the vast majority of them did still buy the DLC, but again, it's off-putting for a lot of people especially newer players or people who have quit may want to come back and it's like, oh, pay $25. Now, it's good with Friends Decay that you can buy each individual campaign, but even then, it is still expensive. That is reality. Whether or not CA should reduce the price, that's a different discussion. There's certainly an argument in favor of it, and regardless of how you personally stand on the price, it's gotta be understood that reducing the price of DLC would certainly have the effect of improving relations to the player base. Because right now, yeah, the price is pretty damn high. Let's put it like that. You can buy many games, entire games for that. Now, Warhammer Free is very good as a game in the sense it has a lot of content, but when you add in all the costs of the DLC, yeah, it kind of gets quite ridiculous. And it's going to take a while for sales to come in for that. Like, we do have the Skulls event, we do have sales on previous DLC, but it's just going to take some time. And look, it's worth pointing this out very clearly. Creative Assembly just went through one of the biggest disasters in gaming history. I've looked really deep. I've gone all kinds of places. I've looked at data. I've asked AI bots, ChatGPT, others. Here's what I found. There's a handful of games that may compare to the disaster of, Shadows of Change. But the only one which we know for certain was a bigger disaster was E.T. There's probably a Star Wars game, especially when you're accounting for inflation, that got canceled, a pretty big one. There is Project Titan that Blizzard canceled, but Blizzard did then take the assets and make Overwatch, so they at least got something out of that. It is very rare for a company to spend $100 million and see absolutely no return whatsoever on investment with respect to that. This is what happened with Hyenas. And it's not just Hyenas. Like, Legend stated that SOC was a disaster because they probably spent as much money on it as Friends Decay. You might ask how they did that, because like Friends Decay was better. Well, remember, they had to release more content with SOC, and on top of that, while SOC did not contain the racial reworks nor reworks for like Karl Franz and Gelt, something or anything similar, it still had 20 people working on it. So maybe it's likely Friends Decay had the bigger budget, all that, and was more costly overall because of all the things that had gone in the company. But CA, like, estimates for Shadows of Change is like it sold like 30,000, 50,000 copies, far lower than Friends Decay. And if Friends Decay is unprofitable, you can bet SOC is unprofitable. And that's not something that I've heard just from Legend. There's other people talking about that as well. So yeah, SOC is probably going to go down in history as one of the biggest disasters in terms of DLC in Creative Assembly's history as a company. And like, if we have to go back over 40 years to find a similar disaster, and mind you, ET is significantly, but if you're a runner-up to something like ET, that is not a good place to be. And my point on that, it's going to take more than one DLC to recover from that. And that is a critical point to make on that. So that is an issue. The pricing issue is certainly real. The content issue is certainly real. And CA's reputation is in the gutter. They've improved it somewhat, but like a lot of people are still very skeptical of them. So like, yes, they did a great job. If anyone from CA is watching this, top of the line job. But if you don't continue down that path, it's going to get bad. And this, what has me worried, and understand this, I want Warhammer Free to do well, because if it does well, I do well as a content creator. My motivation is for it to be a good game. Like, fundamentally is my personal motivation to be a good game, to sell a lot of copies, because then I get a lot more people watching my stuff. A lot of Total War content creators will mention this, but things have been pretty harsh, especially after SOC. Like, Pharaoh was, like, the same month Pharaoh came out, basically. It was one of the worst months I've had on this channel in years. Like, literally in years. I might as well have not worked that entire month. That's how bad Pharaoh was. I might as well not have bothered. So that was how horrible things were with SOC, Pharaoh, and Hyenas. That's the impact, right? When you're focusing your channel on a game and that game screws up in a major way, that those developers screw up in a fairly significant way. I feel generally fairly secure in my job. It's worth pointing out, because YouTube's not going to go anywhere else. But I admit I did quite expect a once-in-a-generation screw-up from CA. I expected screw-ups, don't get me wrong. Anyone who's played Total War as long as I have, I've played since Rome 1 and Medieval 2, like roughly that period. I think Medieval 2 was out when I started playing. I've played since that period for a very long time. I've seen plenty of mistakes made over the years. You know, you can talk about Empire, you can talk about Rome 2, Attila to an extent. Yeah, Attila, you know, some people like Attila. Yeah, Attila is not a great game. But still, so going forward, here's what we know for certain. Like, when I say for certain, people have data mined this, people have gotten leaks, CA themselves have indicated this is going to happen. The next DLC is going to involve Grand Cafe and Ogres. Now, I do certainly hope they rework both those races, as well as the existing lords. So Xiaoming, Miaoying, Rhesus, and Scrag could certainly use some lord reworks. It doesn't have to necessarily be the most substantial reworks of lords, but I think like adding some variety would be great. But it does seem like, and people are saying this, that CA has stated, I haven't quite found that statement. People on Reddit, for instance, are stating that CA would downscale DLC going forward, not have free lords go with less. Okay, so with the next DLC, which is going to have Goldfang, it's going to have the Monkey King, which is going to be Cafean, and it's probably going to have, most likely, it's going to have the Fire Dragon. We're going to get either 2 or 3 Legendary Lords unique ones, maybe some of the ones existing rework, but we're not going to get free racial reworks. And we're probably not going to get the same kind of units and heroes, but that's fine, depends on the price. If they ask $20 for it, yeah, that's going to be a really hard sell, honestly, and they could. I think like 16 or 18 at most, and even 18 is really pushing it from my perspective. That would work, but... And why would they do Cafe? Why would they cancel Slaanesh? Remember, Slaanesh was the plan for Creative Assembly originally after the SOC debacle. But why did they cancel that? Well, simply put, Cafe is the most popular race in Asia. Like, in Europe, it's Kislev, surprisingly, for 2023, funnily enough. But really, the Empire dwarves, as I said, are very popular. They were just in a miserable state. Like, the Empire is one of the most popular races. The reason Kislev wins the charts there in terms of popularity is because if you only buy Warhammer free, you know, you probably are going to be drawn to Kislev. And also, you got to remember the tutorial campaign is Kislev, so I'm not sure if that's counting for anything. Probably is. But the Empire is still an extremely popular race. It's gotten to the point, like, I don't even want to play Kislev. So Cafe, that's the reason they're doing Cafe. Ogre is pretty cool. I am a bit weary of... or a bit concerned about the idea that Creative Assembly is only going to do DLC that is going to be popular, but they've got a lot of goodwill to get back. They want to sell copies, so if they only focus on races that are popular and ignore the ones that aren't, that might work very well. Like, for instance, if they never release a Khorne or Slaanesh DLC, far fewer people will care about that than if they never release it, or Norska. Like, if they leave Norska as is, far fewer people will care about that than, you know, Skaven, Vampire Counts, Tomb Kings, all that kind of stuff, right? So, let me talk, let's assume, however, that Creative Assembly going forward, based on information we have, it does seem CA has a plan of like 6 DLCs total after TOD, or maybe including TOD. But let's say that they have 6 after Thrones of Decay. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that they're going to include 2 racial reworks in those DLCs, not necessarily free. So let's consider the races that don't need a racial rework and the ones that do. So the ones that don't need the racial rework, Chaos Dwarves, could use some improvements, not going to lie. Like, at least early game, just make it more fun, more unit capacity. Early game would be fun, would make that early game more interesting, maybe a bit more money, just very early game, right? Because, like, right now, Chaos Dwarves are extremely powerful. They work very well. No problem on that. But I would just say, like, it can be a bit tedious early game. And I think having a great early game is with a lot of variety is interesting. Don't get me wrong. They can be very, very interesting as they are. I'm not saying they're a bad race. Far from it. I'm just talking about unit caps. Like, maybe having 2 free units by default for all units, or at least the basic ones, like 4 units for Chaos Dwarf Warriors, 2 for the high-end units, would make things a bit more interesting in the early game. Dwarves obviously just got a rework, so they don't need it. Empire doesn't need a rework. Cafe is going to get one. So anyway, we're going to see 10 more reworks, at least. So Chaos Dwarves, Empire, Greenskins. Greenskins, phenomenal race. Maybe some tweaking, you know, Warzag, Scarsnake, Rom, but they're fairly minor stuff. So you've already got 4 races over here that do not need a rework. Nurgle, Could use some climate improvements, infection improvements, building building time improvements, but yeah. If Nurgle doesn't get a rework, they're in a fine place. They went from being genuinely one of the worst, if not the worst races in the game, to at least in a decent spot. Not the terribly great spot, but still it's much better than it was before. So you're looking at 5 races already, then we gotta talk about Skaven. That's 6. So Skaven, like, if anyone tells me Skaven need a freaking rework, I'm sorry. Maybe some campaign changes, maybe Skaven blind me being me like Zarnagrun and Ikakla starting somewhere else, but yeah, Skaven don't need a freaking race rework. And, you know, I'm just talking about races where there's not controversy. So, like, yeah, you got 6 already. There's 24 in the game. We're gonna get 12 more. So that leaves 6 others. This is where we got to talk about, where we're going to get a bit controversial. Warriors of Chaos and Wood Elves are boring as dirt to play, but, I mean, it's kind of hard to say, like, do they need a rework? I would argue they don't, but it's just like they're boring as dirt to play, so that's kind of a problem. Like, I'm not sure FC would fix that, because they're well-designed races. They work phenomenally well. They've got a lot of stuff. They have good units, good economies, good campaign mechanics. It's just like they steamroll so much, it ends up being dull as dirt. So yeah, you got 6 unquestioned races, and then you got 2 more, so you get to 8. That leaves 4. Oh boy. Well, let's talk about the 4 others. Dark Elves. I don't think Dark Elves need a racial rework, honestly. Like, maybe some minor tweaks. Would they even get another DLC pack? I would certainly argue that their campaigns need a rework. The Legendary Lord campaigns need a rework. But Dark Elves, I mean, of all the races that CA needs to improve, they're kind of bottom of the list in some ways. Beastmen, just give us more unit like some minor tweaks, unit caps, maybe some Lord reworks. But Beastmen work fine. Like, they're just not great, but like, you can't complain as much as you would for other stuff. The races that really do need reworks are Norska, Lizardmen, Vampire Coast, Tomb Kings. Slaanesh, of course, as well. You gotta talk about Slaanesh. We can also talk about Tzeentch, by the way. Like, yeah, even though Tzeentch got the DLC, we still gotta talk about that. So those are the kind of races. And maybe Creative Assembly would release DLC for that. Though, I am questioning it. Like, who would they add for the Beastmen, right? Who would they... and obviously Bretonnia could use a rework, but Bretonnia is a free faction. So maybe if CA does decide to do some free stuff and some improvements on top of a paid DLC with like 2 free races, that could happen. That's how I would expect Bretonnia to be improved in any way. Like, I wouldn't expect Bretonnia to be improved like a paid DLC. Though, I don't think anyone would really mind if Bretonnia had a paid DLC character, though. Who exactly would they add? Like, the problem with, like, Beastmen, Bretonnia, Dark Elves, they already have their characters. Like, there's stuff... There's 1-2 characters you can do for the High Elves, certainly. Lizardmen, like, they literally had to drag heroes and make them into lords to make them work. But yeah, Lizardmen absolutely need a rework. Though, I would not be surprised if they never got one. Honestly, like, poor freaking Astamundi. Oh, he's so pathetic. Like, his campaign is awful. We can also talk about Teclis. Like, yeah, there's plenty of lords that need a rework. That's a different discussion. But races, I mean, Lizardmen, yeah, Geomantic Web is crap, and their campaigns are slow, and the jungle is awful. Tomb Kings absolutely need a rework, and we're probably, like, guaranteed we're gonna get Cafe, we're gonna get Ogres, we're gonna get Tomb Kings, we're gonna get Vampire Counts. So those 4 are guaranteed to get it. Will we get anything for Kislev? Will we get anything for Norska? Will we get anything for Bretonnia? We don't know. It would be hilarious if Skaven got a rework, but we know Thanquol is very likely to come. Like, if CA wants to release stuff that's popular, Thanquol is going to come out. But my point in all of this, like, they can either screw it up going forward, or they can do a really great job. For what it's worth, I do hope they deliver. And look, I'm just going to finish with this. And say, and this is exactly what I tell to Creative Assembly. This is what I tell to Sega management if I was sitting right in front of them. You just went through the biggest gaming disaster in 40 years. You are going to have to spend a lot of time recovering from that. But that doesn't mean that recovery is not worth it. You may not make as much money, or you might lose money going forward on Warhammer 3 until you finish it. Yes, That is something that can absolutely happen. But if you don't do it, if you don't deliver properly on this, the next game you release, don't be surprised if it ends up being another disaster. Probably not on the same level as Pharaoh, but yeah, I mean, that World War I game, it can crash and burn. 40K, now look, 40K and Star Wars will obviously be carried by their license. Absolutely. Fun fact on that Star Wars thing, apparently Disney is quite furious with Creative Assembly and Sega over the leaks. Yeah, that's Disney, alright. Like, you know, that's what Legend said, but I do believe it. Because Disney is very, very tight on leaks. Like, I remember with the Loki TV show, one of the actors just did an interview and he was talking about the mustache, I believe it was. And he literally got a call with a warning from the person in charge of the MCU. Like, that's Disney. Like, you gotta understand, that is how Disney does things. They're, like, just largely because of the movie stuff. So they're not happy at all. Hell, Legend speculates at least that it might even be canceled about that. But, I mean, Star Wars is quite a few years away. 40K might be 1-2 years away. And look, don't assume that it's just because it's 40K, it's not a game that can't crash and burn. We've seen a lot of 40K games crash and burn. And if you just, like, if you do, just because they did a great job with TOD, it doesn't mean they can't piss off people even more. Like, they've recovered a bit, but as I would like to say, the great book of grudges remains full. There is a lot of grudges that need to be wiped out from the book. Costin signing out.